Hi and welcome. I'm Dr. Joe. I'm a social worker, hey, and I am a lecturer and a criminal justice researcher. And this is the Safer Tomorrow podcast. Today on the Safer Tomorrow podcast, I have with me Mr. Horace Levy. He is a social advocate, a former lecturer, and he has been involved in many types of social action. He is going to talk with us today about what it means to be a civil society member playing our role in the murder crisis. And he will also share some more information about what crime and violence is like in Jamaica. So stay tuned as we hear more about what we can do as ordinary members of society regarding reducing crime and violence in our nation, Jamaica. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Safer Tomorrow podcast. I'm Dr. Joe. And today I'm so excited because I believe we have a stalwart in the area of crime and violence here with us. He is Horace Levy, Mr. Horace Levy. He is a social advocate. He is a former lecturer at the University of the West Indies. He taught in philosophy, social work. If you ever heard of Peace Management Initiative, Mr. Levy is one of the founders, as well as he has worked with Stand Up for Jamaica that seeks to serve incarcerated citizens. And so we're going to hear more about, what the situation of crime and violence is like in Jamaica and some of what we can do. Because yes, sometimes we feel very powerless. Every day we hear news about crime and violence. Some of us have also experienced it. It causes a lot of fear, pain. It is a burden on our society, just in terms of the cost, and at the very least, well, not least, but the most, people's lives are being lost. And so this is such an important topic, and so I'm so excited. I'm so happy to have you, Mr. Levy. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Joe.
All right. So, we're just going to really jump into it. I want to hear more about what sparked your interest in this whole area of crime and violence.
It wasn't anything major, anything really earthquaking. So it wasn't anything jerking. It was just a gradual something that grew on me that I had to do something about it. And the situation called for something to be done about it. I had been a member of the Social Action Center, a church affiliated group, for over 20 years. And over the last 15 years of that period, I had moved from being a hands-on, on-the-ground person to being a director, to being a supervisor in charge of others. But I wanted to get my hands into things. I wanted to be on the ground, but I was doing the directing from Kingston. So if I was going to do anything on the ground, it had to be in Kingston. Well, as it so happened at this time, this was in the early 1990s, crime was beginning to climb in a very serious way. It had been more or less level between the 400s and the 500s, the murders, over the course of the 80s. But as soon as the 90s began, it began to climb upward. And so I think I glimpsed some of this. And at the same time, I wanted to do something on the ground. So I said, well, the thing to do is to leave the Social Action Center, where I'd been for some 22 years, actually, and begin to do something in Kingston. I did this against the advice of a very good friend of mine. But in short order, I was doing things on, excuse me, on the ground in Kingston. So that's how it all began, Dr. Joe. Right? You asked, yes.
Wow. So, you really have a social work heart, because that's what social work is about to me, being on the ground, being in the action. And even if we're working in admin, we want to be able to impact those who are just directly be able to interact and impact those who are experiencing the different social issues in society. So, what happened next? How did you get so deeply involved into this area of crime and violence?
Well, as Providence would have it, Dr. Joe, I got an invitation from Dr. Barry. At the time, he was head of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies. And he invited me to join a group that was being financed by the World Bank to get some training in a new methodology. It was called Participatory Urban Appraisal, PUA, and later on it became Participatory Learning and Action, PLA, or Participatory Rapid Action. So, yes, I joined that group. It was 12 of us in all, and we got training from an Indian lady who was teaching at the university in the United Kingdom at the time. And we got this training in PLA. It wasn't to be a purely academic thing at all. It was to be a practical thing where you worked in a community and you worked with the community, and out of the learning process, the community itself began to take action. So it was to be that kind of a thing, nothing purely academic at all. And so that went on for several weeks, and we did a practical in a community, which became part of the broader research into 5 communities all told, out of which came eventually, as a byproduct, the little book which I put together, They Cry Respect. The little book, right? So that was that was the thing that got me first of all into, because what we were investigating was the state of crime and violence in 5 inner city communities. 2 of them not in Kingston, 3 in Kingston, 1 in Spanish Town, and 1 in Montego Bay. I shan't name the communities. That's part of the research practice, not to identify communities where people might give them a bad name and so on as a result of the research. So that's how I got into the crime and violence thing, through this bit of research, practical research, which Barry, my good friend, got me into.
Thank you. But I mean, before we move on, I really want to hear a little bit about what you found and wrote about in the book, They Cry Respect. I mean, for me, that was such a game changer. It really was a source of enlightenment for me in terms of how persons within inner city communities, within troubled communities, really experience and view, you know, their own experiences, and how that leads to different types of crime and violence.
Well, what came out of that bit of study was respect, right? They cry respect. One appreciated the need for respect among inner city youth, and the destruction of respect and self-respect by so many things that were going on. Because it wasn't only Barry who invited me in, but Peter Ann Baker, who was going off to do her PhD abroad to complete it, and she wanted somebody to fill her slot at UA. So I ended up getting into that position in 1999, right? And so that allowed me to do some research at the same time, and to get into the history while I was doing the practice. Because in 2002, there was the startup of the Peace Management Initiative. It was started by Dr. Peter Phillips, actually, who was the Minister of National Security in January 2002. So I was not a founder at all, but I was invited along with Barry to be on the board of about a dozen people. And so, but you see, that filling in for Peter Ann at the university and doing that combination was very salutary, very saving, very beneficial for me, because it gave me a chance to study the history of crime and violence, to learn what had happened before that was bad and what was good, as well as at the same time to be doing some practical work about it. And the combination of work on the ground and some research and writing from the academic level, that combination was very, very helpful to me. So that was how I began to get more deeply into it, because when I began to do this study, I learned, for example, that former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson, when he came into his office in 2003, in 1993, he found himself confronted by this rising rate of crime and murder. And he did the extraordinary thing of consulting academics and civil society people. He didn't just jump, as some of his predecessors had done, Shearer and Michael Manley, Hugh Shearer. Hugh Shearer told the police, read them no beatitudes. In other words, shoot first and ask questions after. Don't stop to find out what it's all about. Act quickly. And he was delivering this address to the police. Michael Manley set up that red painted court on South Camp Road, or Camp Road now it was, and brought in a law, Suppression of Crimes Act, which gave the police a bit too much power, much too much power to arrest and detain and so on. And this law actually had to be withdrawn as against the Constitution 10 years later. No, Patterson didn't do that. He consulted to find out, give me a diagnosis of what the problem is that you see in the communities. And he did this, setting up a commission under then Chief Justice Leslie Wolf, who just died a few days ago, and followed that up with two other, that was in 1992, followed it up with two other national committees in 1996 and 2002. And all three, the commission and the two national committees, came up with the same answer, the same diagnosis, what the problem is. They said the problem is that the communities are too deprived and the police are in need of reform. Deal with those two and you will begin to see the murders and the crime go down. Now, there has not been a single other prime minister who has done this kind of thing, who has consulted civil society, the lawyers, the NGOs, that is the non-government organizations, as well as the security forces, to get a proper diagnosis of what's really wrong and how to go about it. The unfortunate thing is that PJ did not follow up to implement what these committees told him. And it wasn't just those three. There was another commission in 2011 or 10, after the incursion into Tivoli Gardens. They came out with a report in 2016, rather late, just after Andrew Holness became Prime Minister, just a couple of months after. And they came out with exactly the same analysis, the same diagnosis of what the problem was. Community deprivation, police and security forces, more broadly, in fact, than just police, but especially the police, and especially the Mobile Reserve Unit, are in need of reform. Right? So that was a bit of the history, which I got to know something about as a result of being in a position to do the research and to understand, to get the background. The only thing that came out of, two things came out, of P.J. Patterson and his committee's research. The police force did try to introduce in mid-1990s community policing, right, which would be something more on the ground, less violent and so on. The problem was that it ran headlong into the practice that existed in the police force. And that practice brushed aside the attempts to carry out this community policing. So it got nowhere. The other thing that did get somewhere in 2002 was Dr. Phillips, who set up this peace management initiative in January, and that was, I referred to it earlier on. So that was something positive. It wasn't, of course, able to do anything about removing the deprivation of communities. That was something that it required a state, a government to do. But it began to probe into communities and to do something at the community level. So that's, a bit of an answer to your question, Dr. Joe.
This is necessary, important information for us as we go further in understanding the whole issue of crime and violence in Jamaica. And though we are hoping that some of the lessons that are learned and are discussed in this setting can be adapted and understood and learned to be adapted in other countries, it's very important for us to understand the Jamaican context. And before we go on, again, I have another question, because what is prevalent in the Jamaican society is a discussion about being tough on crime versus what persons would say being soft on crime and trying to, help in terms of social intervention. Why is it important to um also be soft on crime, and is there a place for being tough on crime?
Well, that question is a question about what the PMI, the Peace Management Initiative, was and did. First of all, the PMI, these 12 people who were invited to be on the board, we had no staff initially. These 12 people were made up, 6 of them were from the 2 political parties, because both of these parties were facing elections in 2002, the end of 2002. And both wanted a peaceful election. The Jamaica Labour Party wanted it because 6 months before, in mid-2001, there was a clash between the police and members of a gang in Tivoli Gardens, and some 26 or 27 people died. And polls showed people thinking, oh, the JLP is a rather bloodthirsty set of people. And the leader of the JLP, Mr. Edward Seaga, didn't want that image at all. So he very much wanted a peace management initiative, something that would help to cut into the possibility of murder and crime, marring the elections at the end. And of course, the PNP wanted it too. They were the ruling party, so they wanted a peaceful election. So sure enough, we got going. But I started to say 6 of the 12 were members, 3 each, of the 2 main parties. The other 6 were made up of church people, Bishop Harold Blair, who became the chairperson of PMI, and another reverend, and the 2 people from academia, Barry Chavance and me, and 2 others who were civil society people. One of them was Donna Parchment. She had acquired a brown at the end of her parchment at that time. Dispute Resolution Foundation, that's right, a lawyer and a very fair-minded person. She was to become the deputy chair of the PMI. So there were 6 and 6. And of the 6 of us who were really from civil society, we were the ones who went into the communities. We knew nothing. This is our first time we were doing anything like this. This was an amazing thing that Dr. Phillips was doing. He was inviting unarmed civilians to go into communities and to head off or prevent community violence. Unarmed civilians. Nothing like this ever had been done before, right? We were going in without guns, without weapons, without any security. I remember the very first meeting that we had of Mountain View. Some police came circling by thinking we needed protection or something. We said, no, thank you. And we sent them on their way very politely. Another time they showed up, again, a different community in the same locale approximately. They showed up before we did. And that, I'm afraid, gave us a black eye, because it looked as though this was a setup. We were about to have a meeting with a group of youth who were engaged in some warring with another group, and here the police were showing up. So that was the end of that particular meeting, and we had to make up some ground after that. So we didn't want, we kept our distance from the police. We were happy to have them working in the communities to deal with such crime and murder as was taking place, but we had to keep our distance because the youth were talking to us, and we had to win their trust, their confidence. Our job was not to police them, was not to find out who was doing what wrong, and to cart them off to jail or wherever. We were on a different mission altogether. We went in there to listen to them, to hear them, right? And we discovered that these youth were not the shower posse type. They were not engaged in trading in guns, in extortion. They were not hitmen. They were youth defending their communities against rival communities, right? And these communities were divided politically. So one set was defending a PNP community. Another set was defending a JLP community against the attacks from the other side. And when we listened to these young people, 15 years going up to late 30s. Of course, the first set we heard, we said, well, the people who are attacking you, they're awful set. They're a terrible set. Until we heard from the other side and found out that the other side was saying the exact same thing that the first side was saying, right? So we were learning, right? The people who helped us get into the communities were two from the 6 political representatives on the board. 2 of them, Desmond McKenzie and Paul Burke, from respectively the JLP and the PNP, they were more acquainted with the inner city, and they could guide us, gave us some guidance as to who the gatekeepers might be and how to get into these communities, right? So they helped us initially until we became more acquainted. And later on, those 2 were to resign from the board voluntarily. Nobody pushed them over at all. But so we began to learn something about what was happening. And these were youth defending their communities. They had guns. They used the guns. They were guilty of killing. There's no question about it, right? So they were doing some things that were crimes, but they were not the usual kind of criminal, right? Now, of course, it was difficult. The police, of course, were very skeptical about us not calling them criminals, right? But certainly, if they were facing a judge in a court, they were treated quite differently from a hard-bitten, planning criminal, somebody who was planning a murder. These were not planners. So at first, then, we met with the individual communities. And then having met with them separately, we persuaded them to meet jointly with us. Of course, we couldn't find a neutral spot in any community. So we ended up in hotel rooms or, restaurants. And there they spoke to one another, shouted at one another. Hotel attendants had to come in and ask us to keep the noise down. It was frightening away their other guests. But listening to one another and hearing one another, they began to realize that the other side was saying pretty much the same thing that they were saying. And they began to realize that trying to track back who killed my uncle or my brother or my father first was a fairly futile effort, and that we needed to do something differently. So we worked on them and managed to persuade them through various incentives to take part in some sporting competitions, football, playing together against one another, and sometimes against other communities, playing together on the same team, right? Which really helped to cut in to the rivalry between Community A and Community B. So that was the next stage, to bring them together and to begin to persuade them. The incentives I mentioned, these were not to giving out money by any means. One was the sporting competition. Another one was to invite them to engage in small economic activities, right? Where we would help to provide some of the materials, say to raise chickens or to build blocks, cement blocks or something like that. So small community enterprises, and so some of them got involved in those kinds of things. And then a next stage would be to get them to come in groups of 40 or 50 out on camps, out of the city entirely, in some semi-rural area, a very highly disciplined camp where we would expose them to videos and discussions and lectures on community support, on drugs, dealing with hard drugs, on sexuality, on careers, and on how to organize themselves, right? These would be, 3-4 day retreats, 40 to 50 of them. And these turned out to be extremely important, life for perhaps 3/4, 75% of those who participated. So that's the kind of thing that the PMI did. And these were youth who were not on the radar of hardened criminals, the police radar in that regard. But the police, of course, regarded them with considerable suspicion and very dubious about our dealing with them in the first place. But that's the kind of thing that PMI engaged in, right? Dealing on a one-on-one basis with these youth, right? And then later on, doing something that came to be called as violence interruptions. We organize those who are violence interrupters, who would meet with the youth, talk with them, and in fact dissuade them from beginning an activity which would lead to confrontation with somebody else and into violence action, right? And this would be between some of the people who were violence producers. But, well, the violence interrupters had to deal with youth, young people, mostly male, who were engaging in activities which could lead to shooting and to death and to killing of others. So it was to head that kind of thing off. This could be very, very dangerous. And in fact, we had a couple of occasions, because on the one hand, to one side of what we were doing with these younger people were the criminal gangs. And to give you one example, one of the persons who was a violence interrupter also operated a small business of his own repairing cell phones. And that gave him access to a lot of information, a lot of contacts. A criminal gang wanted to enroll him into their number, and he declined. He lost his life. And they wanted him because of the kind of information they thought he had. So, I mean, that's an example of someone who is really on the front line, reducing the violence, heading it off, and suffered the loss of his life as a result. So the violence interrupters were very much on the front line, and they were highly successful. I mean, there were communities around Spanish Town. There were a couple, I know of more than one, where for a whole year there was not. So so they were successful in being able to head off a lot of the murders and the crimes. And that's one of the success stories that PMI has recorded. And this is not just something I'm saying. This is something that has been researched by Dr. Herbert Gale, who has come up with a judgment that as to the success rate and the efficacy, and he rated it very, very highly. This is a research he did about 3 years ago.
Okay, so I mean, I know that you said success story, but he lost his life. That's, you know, that's significant. How as a member of PMI were you able to move on and still work in this area despite the risk?
Well, that particular case was not a common case, right? It wasn't something that happened every day, clearly. We were able to move on. I mean, essentially, what I need to say is that what the PMI was trying to do with these youth was to mainstream them, to move them off the path of violence they were on. And the retreats, the camps that we carried out, one of the things we did on these camps was to have a psychologist interview them. And as a result of these interviews, we're able to create case studies of every one of those who participated. Uh, did the young man want to do some more academic study? Did he want to do a practical training with heart? Did he want to start a project? What was it he wanted to do? And so we're able to give guidance to these youth and to mainstream them in that regard. And this carried on all the way through. This was an essential element of the work we were doing. So the important thing to bear in mind is that what PMI focused on was the relationships between youth and youth, relationships between the youth and their parents, between both of these and the police. Relationships is a central element. This is what makes society. It is the social dimension of living. Right? So it's well and good to talk about infrastructure, and this is needed. It's important to fix the drains and the fences and the roofs and so on. But those things, while important, are secondary to the relationships between the people involved in these communities. And it's on those relationships that the PMI has been focusing on all along until it's no longer is in existence now because of lack of funding and poor management itself. So that's the answer to your question, Dr. Joe. Uh, there was another thing you wanted to raise, though, was there?
I wanted to hear another example or another two examples of success stories from PMI, from the PMI experience.
Well, remember, PMI came into existence in 2002. That year and the year that followed, there was a 15% reduction in murders, right? From 1,100 and something to 900 and something murders over those 2 years. Now, PMI is not claiming exclusive credit for that. The parties were also trying. A Dispute Resolution Foundation was working. PALS, Peace and Love in Schools, was in operation. So there are a number of other agencies doing things. But I think the PMI contributed something worthwhile. But in addition to that, for example, in Jonestown, there was a 3-year war going on in Jonestown. I think the years might have been 2005 to 2007. Within a few months, the Peace Management Initiative was able to assist the community to put an end to that war, right? And this is a war which took, some 60 chronicled deaths. We could record the number of people, and did record, who actually died in that war. The same thing in Franklin Town, Brownstown, that area. Over 80 deaths. Were able to put an end to their internal warring, right? And there are several other communities in which there was a similar reduction in murder and in crime. And this was taking place. There was an over 40% reduction in the Kingston metropolitan area in murder at a time when nationally the murder rate was going up and would reach in 2009 the highest it ever has reached, 1,684, I think, right? So at the very time when nationally it was going on, in one area, this Kingston metropolitan area, right, the murders actually declined over 40%. So I think, and this has been chronicled, it's been recorded. Uh, um, it's not something I'm just making up at all. We have the documents to show it, the files to show it. And so that's the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. All right, so in society here, I mean, crime has really become a kind of us and them problem. So, you know, we are over here, we are the upstanding citizens, and then them over there, those over there are the ones that are causing all the issues in society. How did that happen? Isn't crime a kind of a societal problem? How did we get to this place where we believe that it's those persons over there versus us over here and we're the better ones?
Yes, it's easy to think of the bad guys as the guys in the gangs, and we are the good guys. And, it's an eternal struggle between good and evil. But life is not as simple as that. It's not all black and white, there's gray. And gray is the predominant color. Most of us are in the gray region. We're good people essentially, but we wander off sometimes. We stray, and we commit some wrong things. We're well intentioned, of course, but we make mistakes. We make serious errors of judgment and of goodness. So it's a wrong perspective. Now, it's an easy one to get into, where you have a class division such as we have, which is also tinged with race and color in Jamaica. So it's easy for the political class, even though many of them come from working class origins, some of them at least. Once they have moved up out of their origins into the middle class, they acquire middle class perspectives and attitudes and outlooks, and fail to remember or to keep abreast of the conditions in which poorer people and lower class people are exposed to. And so this class division is a major reason, because if it's not that, and it's not just the class divisions, there's also the overall what's come out of these class divisions is a system in which people are caught. For example, the youth have been manipulated, used by the political parties to defend, respectively, each one against the other, right? Parents, many of them, have been brought up to treat their children rather roughly. Mothers to beat, especially the sons, believing that beating is what is going to cure them, when in fact what you're doing is beating all self-respect out of them. The police have been trained in a certain way under the Suppression of Crimes Act. And so they too will pick up youth who are loitering or who are not in work and so on, put them in jail for no serious reason at times. So, you have a system that's operating in which there are good people and there are bad people, but there are a lot of people in between who are trying to be good, but who are being dragged by certain things in the system away from what they should be. And that's the genesis of the us and them thing, when in fact we do all have to realize we're a part of a single society, and that you can't take those, for example, the youth who are not serious criminals, and simply lump them and treat them the same way you treat the serious criminals, the hardened ones. They have to be dealt with differently. We have to work out a different system, whereby they are heard and opportunities are provided to them to escape from what has been created around them by improper parenting, bad policing, and by activities of the political parties, which have been harmful too, because political parties have often supported the criminal elements and supported their use of violence against people. So, you know, to get out of that scenario, we have to create a new one, a different one. And you can only do that by beginning to listen to those who are in it, and understand what they're going through, and help them to come out of the bad influences that exist out there.
But Mr. Levy, I'm not a police person. I'm not a policewoman. I'm not a parent of, you know, a young person from the inner city. I didn't live in the inner city. I am just a normal citizen that I go to work, I come home, I pay my bills, I take care of my kids. What do I have to do with them over there committing the crimes? What does that have to do with me? Right? How do I have an influence on what happens, in this society where crime and violence is concerned? Why should I care?
You should care because you are part of the society. You are part, in particular, of the civil society element of the society. The society is made up of those members of the state, the government, those who are in business, the private sector, and those who are in neither of those two, which is the rest of us, the the people who are going to work every day, who are raising families, who are living their lives of culture and dance and song and music and so on. So we're part of that third element, and it's that third element, civil society, of which the PMI has been functioning as, even though it was joined up with the state and getting some support from the state. The activities of PMI that we've been talking about have been those of civil society members. At no time were we taking directives from the state as to what to do or how to do it. So civil society has a very, very important role to play in many respects, right? The fact is that we're aware sometimes as members of civil society of a domestic conflict next door, right? And if we're aware of that, and you can hear from the shouting and the screaming and so on, then we can do something to intervene or to advise some authority of what's happening there, the police perhaps, to get them to intervene if it's dangerous for you to do so. That's one area in which ordinary people can do something. And then if we see suspicious activity taking place in our neighborhood, right, we can communicate this again to the security forces. In other words, we can share information with the police. They're calling for it all the time. Our culture has been built up of informer and informer for dead, right? And that's prevailed, but it can be avoided. We must stop that culture. We must not allow it to intimidate us and prevent us from doing something which will reduce crime. And then there are other things that we can do as civil society, right? We can begin to help those who are poor in our neighborhood, who are we can see very plainly are in need of help. There's various ways in which church groups do this, right? But not only welfare activities, but political and socio-political interventions. We can cry out, we can take part in the discussions, for example, about the Constitution that are taking place right now. This is extremely important. The participation of civil society in political activities, not just in supporting one party or the other. We can do that too, and that's very important. We need to cast our ballot at election time. We should not withdraw or remove ourselves from the political process by any means. But in addition to taking part in the choice of a party to manage the affairs of the country, and in addition to learning, to studying what each of the parties is doing, so we take an informed decision. We're not just doing it on the basis of, well, my daddy did it, or my mama did it, or they belong to such and such a party, therefore I should belong to it. No. But in addition to all of that, what I'm saying is there are other activities, like taking part in the discussions around the Constitution right now, right? Or watching the parliamentary accounts committee when it interviews the Auditor General and the Auditor General's criticisms of one ministry or the other, right? We can listen out for that, and we can express our opinions in letters, in talk shows, in calls to the radio stations. So there are multiple things that we can do, and I'm especially one who a great supporter of that social advocacy. That every citizen, every individual, we can do things together. We must, right? We our community group, our parents group, our our professional group, we can act as part of these and do as much, but also as individuals. We can be calling in to a radio station. We can be helping to push a particular, to push the government to take a particular action, let's say around prisoners, that they should be treated a certain way and should be allowed to get to be rehabilitated, and what kind of a prison we should have. Individuals can open their mouths and talk about these things, and this is what we can do as civil society.
Thank you. I like what you said. And I know for me, like one of the things I'm very passionate about is for us to also remember as members of civil society that there is what you call direct violence and indirect violence. And direct violence tends to be what we see when somebody shoots somebody, chop up somebody, and there's a clear victim. But indirect violence you don't necessarily clearly see a harm done, physical harm done to the individual, but it is a system that excludes people from certain amenities and being able to participate as citizens in a country, right? And so, even as you spoke about your book, They Cry Respect, in your other book, which I always tell you I love, Killing Streets, right? So indirect violence or structural violence or institutional violence, as it can be called, is something that we all can do. It is something that, if we prevent somebody from getting a job because of where they live, right? That's a type of violence because they are unable to um build and develop and foster the type of life that would allow them to fully participate in society. And so I really think it's important for us to know that we can be a part of a system that create barriers and obstacles that prevent people from being able to participate in voting, right? In just normal activities in life. And as a result of that, it leads them to finding non-conventional, criminal type ways to live their lives, right? And so, even with that, and as I think about that, Mr. Levy, how has crime and violence, or how did crime and violence really evolve in this nation, in Jamaica? I know that there are some pre-independence perspectives. And so I just want to hear from your perspective and your experience, how did crime and violence evolve?
It's important, I think, to bear in mind, for Jamaicans to bear in mind, that up until 1940, let us say, we had nothing. We didn't have the violence we have now. We didn't have any violence to speak of. We had the workers rebelling and staging protests, and some of them being killed by the British, by the police, led by the British, outside Frome factory. But there wasn't the violence and the crime and the murders. The number of murders a year, in 1962 was the year of our independence, was like 3 out of every 100,000 people. Now it's over 50 for every 100,000 people. So one can't trace the violence back to slavery up to that earlier period. It's something that's grown up, and it grew up to begin with as a result of the competition between the two political parties. It wasn't anything very bloodthirsty. It was stones and sticks between the two parties, trying to intimidate each other's meetings back in 1944, the year of the first election. That's where it began, right? Very simple, very small, and then it grew. The competition between the two trade unions, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union and the trade union Council or Trade Union Congress of the PNP, right? So one for the JLP and one, and they are in conflict, each trying to win the workers to their particular, and a few people died, but not many, right? Not many died, just a handful. The real big development took place in that regard, began to in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Uh, and again, it was competition between the two political parties. Uh, so that we ended up with a near civil war in 1980. The violence had grown just very, very gradually as a result of competition between the parties, right? And the criminal element began to develop as well as a result of that. So it's been a very, very gradual process, and other elements have come into it. Obviously, uh, the the business of trading in drugs, for example, in the 1980s. So because it's grown up gradually, and the murders have developed gradually, the number of murders, it's become part of our way of life, regrettably. And so we respond to disagreement by turning to violence instead of reasoning. So if we are to change the situation, we have to recognize the roots of it. And the roots are the ones I indicated earlier on. The essentially the deprivation and the use of police in the wrong way, right? Until we deal with this vast difference between one set of people and the other, right? Until we begin to address the community needs, and it's not just material needs by any means, but the relationships, the relationships within deprived communities, until we begin to rebuild our communities uh, and cut through the class differences that are holding one set of people down and not giving them an opportunity. It is that lack of opportunity, this deprivation of, and particularly of young people, which is at the root of it. So you cannot cure this flow of violence and murders by, as one commentator said recently, by mopping up the leaks and the overflows here and there. You have to address the source of this flow, and this is not being done. So until the source, the root, which has been diagnosed from the early 1990s and which some people knew even before the diagnosis came out of that first commission and the other national commissions and so on, and the police reform attempts as well, until we are prepared to deal with that and to try to um, to to overcome and to get around or to cut through the class differences and the racial differences which is dividing our country, we will not solve the violence and the murder thing.
Just repeat that we will not solve. Yeah.
We will not solve the violence and the murder problem we have, the crisis we have, uh, unless we address the root of the problem and stop trying just to deal with the symptoms.
Thank you. So, as you speak about the murder crisis and the violence, I mean, yes, I'm in the professional space. I did my research in desistance from crime in terms of leaving a life of crime and reintegration. But also, as a citizen, it's a scary thing to think about. What can we do as ordinary members of civil society um, to end, reduce, but let's say end the murder crisis in this nation?
recognize to begin with that you have power. You have power. You are able to do something. You have simply to address your mind to what you're able to do and focus on it. You are able to influence how the Constitution is going to be shaped, who is going to have the power. How much power should the Prime Minister have? How much power should the political parties have? Shouldn't their power be shared with civil society? That is what I would argue. That it's no longer, we're past the stage now where we only have political parties running the government of this country. We need something called governance. Governance. And for governance, you need to have not just the political parties managing the country, you need to have the civil society involved, and you need to have the private sector, right? Until that comes about, we will not have the success that we all desperately need and want. That's my view. Sorry. But, it's individually, I mean, I know from my own personal experience, to put aside violence, to put aside reacting with anger or with harsh words, and from that with violent actions, and to respond to a difference of opinion, a difference in behavior of a young person, of a son or a daughter, or a friend or a neighbor, to react to those things by talking it out, reasoning it out, to do it that way rather than to reacting with anger. I mean, I have been guilty in the past of reacting in anger. I know that. And that's violence on my part. Absolute violence. There's no question about it. And I've treated some of my children in that way. So it's one has to change. All of us have a bit of that in us, and some of it have more of it because of our upbringing, our position, our temperament, and so on. But all of us have to tackle that 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 inclination to violence, which is in all of us. Until we begin to do that, we're not getting anywhere.
I like what you said there because sometimes, again, in terms of the perspective of us and them, we don't recognize that some of the same types of behavior and attitudes that we see in them, we actually display. And we may display them differently and maybe not to the extent that we see in terms of bodily harm, but some of how we respond in terms of attitudes and behaviors, as I was mentioning before, does fuel a system that then can lead to direct violence. And so it's important for us. I love, again, when you spoke about the importance of recognizing we have power. And I would also want to add to that it's important for us to recognize that people change. So just like how we change when we're changing our diet and when we're changing our behaviors and our attitudes to different aspects of life, in the same way, persons who are involved in criminality are able to change. And when we do have that perspective, as you say, then it opens up different types of possibilities, and it allows us to think differently so that we ourselves can think about ways in which we can contribute to, or let me say it this way, no longer contribute to the structure of violence that exists in our nation, and now we can be more of now we can be more a part of the solution. So thank you so much for that. And I would say finally, I mean, it has been an enlightening discussion and conversation. But again, I would, for the listeners, just really, and the viewers, I just really want for us, and I say us because I also need to think this through and think it's important to hear from you. What are some actionable steps that, as a regular citizen going about my daily life, I can do to end the murder crisis and just reduce crime and violence in our nation generally?
Well, if you're a car driver, you can obey the rules of the road now and keep your speed down, and that kind of thing. Multiple ways. How you dispose of your garbage, your waste. um, you know, how you how you treat your work. How much do you put into your work? How much time do you spend with your son or your daughter to help them uh, um, to with their schoolwork, um, or their friends or their problems, listening to them and talking with them, rather than being listening to them and discussing things with them, rather than running off uh, to play football with your friends, or to play bridge, or to socialize, whatever it might be. Um, so there are multiple ways in which every one of us can live out our lives in ways which contribute to a greater peace and harmony in the country.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your. Well, let me ask it this way. So, if I am speaking to my children, what does that have to do with the murder crisis? If I am in a car and I'm driving badly, what does it have to do with the murder crisis? I'm not necessarily hurting anybody.
Well, not necessarily, but you may. Um, you can. One has to look at the positive side, not just at the negative of not doing something bad, but there's so many positive things that one can do which build up the positive things in life. And that's the side of it which perhaps we tend not to look at so much. But how you treat uh, the garbage man who just passed by in his efforts to collect the bags, how you talk to him, how you respond to his greeting. Uh, you know, so there are things that we can do positively all the time, which build up the the social capital, the relationships, the positive relationships of mutual trust, of mutual affection and support, uh, um, and not just think of it in terms of uh, not doing the negative. So there's that aspect of it, which um, I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question, but um, okay. Well, shall we rest it there?
Mr. Levy, I just want to say thank you so much for being on Safer Tomorrow, the Safer Tomorrow podcast today, and just sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. I mean, what's important in this particular podcast are solutions, because we can get very caught up in the problems, and yes, we know that this is what the issue is and this is what the issue is and the state need to do this and that person over there need to do this, but we divorce it from ourselves. And so it's so important for us to really think about, what does this mean for me, not just as a victim, but as maybe a possible perpetrator in the system, but also a member of society that has the power to make a difference. And I just want to share with my listeners these two books. I mean, we mentioned They Cry Respect before, that Mr. Levy wrote some years ago. Was it in the 90s or the 2000s? 96. Okay, that's what I had in my mind. Right. So 96. And then we have Killing Street and Community Revival here. And then we have his newest book, Jamaica, Fractured Nation, Vibrant People. And so these are, if you want to know more about the history, about even just some of the perspectives that persons living within inner city communities have about the rest of society, about their own experiences, these are some important books to read. So I just thank you, listeners and viewers, for being here with us. I want to encourage you I want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our Instagram page, Say for Tomorrow Pod, and like, comment, share. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye.